Napoleon. They called him a military genius, the Emperor of France, the nightmare of Europe. But have you ever wondered beyond the applause and the gilded statues, what secrets might be hidden that you've never heard before? Tonight I won't tell you a dry, lifeless story of history. I'm offering you a question no one has ever dared to ask, and no one has ever dared to answer. Look at Napoleon not as a proud king, but as a man willing to sacrifice everything just to carve his name into eternity. Can you hear it? The pounding of drums out there, the horses' neighs, the clash of steel, like a reminder he was not only fighting enemies, he was fighting history itself. Have you ever wondered why did someone like him need to be remembered at any cost? Why wouldn't he back down even when the world was already soaked in blood? We always talk about Napoleon like he's a legend, but every legend has its cracks. I'm not here to lead you into a tale with a happy ending. I'm here to lead you into a maze of ambition and darkness, where every paving stone whispers, "Who was Napoleon, really?" That's right, we talk about his campaigns, his conquests, his triumphal marches. But no one talks about the moments when he vanished from his own light. And I'm sure you've never heard those stories. Are you ready? Step through this door and look at the flickering fire outside. That isn't a fire for warmth. It's a fire that burns away the secrets Napoleon carried to his final breath. Listen closely. Tonight there are whispers in the wind, not from enemies, but from the ghosts of the past. Ghosts that never found a place in history books, but still linger in every inch of earth he once marched across. You think you know Napoleon. You think he was either a genius or a madman. I won't give you an answer. I'll leave you with a single black ink line, a single thread to follow, and you'll have to trace it yourself. Because tonight we're not searching for the truth. We're searching for secrets that will never be carved into any headstone, but still whisper in every icy gust of winter wind. Can you hear it? The rustling of torn maps, the heavy thudding beat of a heart that claimed it knew no fear or maybe just pretended to. Napoleon. Was he a conqueror, or a man who used war to run away? A lover who fell so hard, or a man who hurled his own heart into an abyss? I won't tell you everything. I'll only bring you to the threshold so you can feel the breath of that darkness for yourself. Don't believe everything you've ever been told. Ask yourself, did Napoleon ever truly exist? Or was he only the shadow of ambition that humanity fears the most? Because tonight, amid the drums of battle and the sighs of lost souls, we begin a journey with no map, no guide, only one question. Do you dare to look into Napoleon's eyes and face the secret no one has ever dared to tell? We're going back to 1769, the island of Corsica, a land that the French had barely held for a year. And there a child was born, Napoleone Bonaparte, a name that weighed heavy like a destiny that would force him to step beyond the shadows of where he was born. Napoleon was born to a minor noble family, poor and struggling. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a local lawyer always scrambling to find his place between the French aristocracy and the Italian Corsican blood that ran in his veins. His mother Letizia was a woman of iron who spent her life teaching her son one thing. In this world, no one will ever reach out to save you. From an early age, Napoleon lived in a world where everything was threatened. The French looked down on the Corsicans, it seeped into every word, every glance. At school, French children had the right to mock the thick Corsican accent he couldn't hide. That small, slight boy, he never forgot the contempt in those eyes. Modern psychology would call this the primal wound, the feeling of having your self-worth stolen from you before you're even old enough to fight back. For a child like Napoleon, mocked for his accent, treated as an outsider, in a land he was told to call his own, that humiliation didn't fade, it turned into fuel. There are stories that say when Napoleon was small, he would sometimes declare, "One day everyone will have to listen to me," a vow unspoken out loud but etched into his stare. At 9, Napoleon was sent to France to study at the military academy in Brienne. There they say he had no friends. He spoke little, always frowning, but those dark eyes recorded every insult, every mocking laugh. There's a tale that says Napoleon often wandered alone, clutching a book of Plutarch or Julius Caesar, whispering to himself, "Great men have always been scorned." He didn't just want to be a soldier. He wanted to crush the idea that the Corsican boy would forever be just a speck of dust. The years at Brienne were years of isolation and silent rage. Modern studies of adolescent psychology show children denied social validation from an early age tend to split in two directions. Either they accept defeat and become shadows, or they burn to become rulers. Napoleon chose the second path. But it wasn't just because he was looked down upon. That child possessed a sharp mind, an intense passion for military history, and an extraordinary ability to focus. Every ancient campaign he devoured it, as if drinking in every drop of blood it held. Many psychoanalysts have suggested Napoleon wasn't a bloodthirsty monster, he was a boy who wanted to turn his pain into power. That's why when he became the youngest artillery officer in the French army, people still thought, that little Corsican boy will never rise above his station. But he never forgot. And every victory after that, from Toulon to Austerlitz, was like a blade driven into the memories of his childhood. I'm no longer small, I'm the one who will make all of Europe kneel. Napoleon, the child born on an island of howling winds, he turned every taunt into fuel. But that fuel didn't just feed his ambition. It also planted a seed of darkness, a nagging fear that if he ever stopped, he'd be forgotten again, buried under the same scornful laughter he'd always known. Modern psychology calls this the insecure overachiever syndrome. Those who suffer from it never rest because every triumph only lasts a few breaths, and then the obsession returns, I'm still not enough. Remember this when you look at Napoleon, he wasn't just conquering enemies, he was conquering the scar he carried within. And that scar, it was the starting point for everything ambition, love, even cruelty. Tonight, when we look at this man, don't just see an emperor with glorious victories. See the child standing alone in a foreign schoolyard, gripping a book of history, whispering, "One day everyone will know my name." That was the first seed planted in the darkness of a lonely childhood. And from there, Napoleon was no longer just a boy, he was a storm growing out of the depths of his own solitude. But it didn't stop there. Those childhood wounds didn't just turn Napoleon into a power-hungry conqueror, they haunted him in love as well. And there are many theories that it was precisely this, the merging of love and power, that created the legendary Napoleon, an emperor whose every decision, every battle held the shadow of one woman. Some even say his love, or more accurately his obsession, became the driving force behind his bloody campaigns. As if every battle wasn't just to subdue an enemy, but to silence the anxious flicker he always saw in Josephine's eyes. If we trace it back to the beginning, that Corsican boy Napoleone grew up in a world that didn't want him. And when his first love appeared, Josephine, she wasn't some innocent girl. Josephine had lived through marriage, widowhood, and countless glittering Parisian soirees. She had been pushed to the sidelines just as Napoleon had been dismissed as a child. Did he see in her a reflection of himself, or was she the ultimate test of his fear of being abandoned? Napoleon loved Josephine with a desperate intensity. His letters to her sometimes passionate, sometimes clumsy, even brazen. At times he ordered, "Come to me right this instant." At other times he pleaded like a drowning man, "Josephine, just one sign to let me know. You won't leave me." Modern psychology suggests those who grow up deprived of love, haunted by the fear of being forgotten, often turn love into a battlefield. They don't just want to possess, they want to conquer the other person's very soul. Josephine, did she truly not love him? Or was it that Napoleon never allowed her the chance to? History still argues, did Josephine betray him on those lavish Parisian nights perhaps? But Napoleon knew, and yet he clung to her as if she were the final crown he had yet to claim. They say that after every battle he didn't write first to the Ministry of War, he wrote to Josephine. "I have won. Did you hear it? Do you see that I'm no longer the Corsican boy they once mocked?" Some say that was love. Others say it was just Napoleon, a man who would never allow anyone to forget him, not even the woman he adored most. And it's here in this tangled love that we see another Napoleon, not the conqueror but the supplicant. Not the invincible emperor, but a man who only wanted to feel a little warmth. But Josephine was never an easy prize, and maybe that drove Napoleon mad. Every time she pulled away, he threw himself back into new campaigns, as if the blood spilled on the battlefield could drown out the fear in his heart. There's a tale that on the eve of the Italian campaign he sat alone by the fire flipping through her letters. His eyes glowed red, not from fatigue, but from rage. "I will never let her or anyone bring me to my knees," he muttered to himself. Was that the moment he decided if he could not have one woman's heart, he would have an entire continent? Historians have said Napoleon conquered the world, but he never conquered Josephine. And that perhaps was the one defeat he could never accept. Psychologists call this the great compensation mechanism. When a hunger can never be sated, it grows into something larger, an empire, a monument, an immortal legacy. But the original fear, it still smoulders, still demands blood and tears to be quieted. So what do you think Josephine did? She truly not love him? Or was her love a love that was never quite enough? The eternal spark that fed Napoleon's endless hunger. And Napoleon, did he truly love her? Or did he only love the reflection of himself, a man demanding absolute devotion? These questions still hang in the air like the smoke of gunpowder after every battle. History gives no answer. It leaves only letters, stone statues and numbers of the dead that mean nothing. But we know this from the little boy mocked in Corsica to the Emperor of France. Napoleon never stopped chasing what he could never quite hold. And Josephine, even though she's long gone, still lingers in every campaign, every bottomless ambition he ever had. But Napoleon's secrets didn't stop there. Beyond his fabled love for Josephine, that love that was both his weapon and his wound, he harboured other obsessions few would suspect. One of them was perfume. That's right, Napoleon was obsessed with scent to the point of compulsion. He didn't wear it merely for outward glamour. For Napoleon, perfume was an invisible shield, a delicate mask to cover the exhaustion, the anxiety that even power couldn't chase away. Why imagine on the battlefield, in the mud and blood and sweat of thousands of soldiers, a whiff of citrus, musk and herbs surrounded him like a tiny oasis, a reminder that he was more than a warrior. He was still a man. They say he was particularly addicted to Eau de Cologne 4711, that classic German scent of citrus, herbs and cedar. A fragrance fresh and bright, yet with a warm base like the man himself, cold and calculating on the outside, always burning within. Napoleon didn't use perfume sparingly. Records say he went through as many as 60 small bottles a month. He would dab it on his neck, his wrists, his gloves, even on his handkerchief, and the paper of his letters. Maybe it was his way of leaving his mark everywhere so no one would ever forget he had been there. Some historians even believe he would scent the letters he sent to Josephine, so that when she opened them, his smell would rise up. A subtle fragrance, but also a wordless command. Even if you turn away, my breath will still linger on your skin. For Napoleon, perfume wasn't just luxury. It was a silent message, a soft mask he wore to hide the nights he couldn't sleep, the moments he woke in terror, seeing himself not as emperor, but as that frightened Corsican boy again. Have you ever thought a man who conquered the world, who made Europe kneel, still needed a hint of scent to calm his heart? But that was Napoleon. A man who knew sometimes a drop of fragrance can quiet the fiercest storm. And it didn't stop there. He was also deeply superstitious, a superstition so at odds with the image of a rational iron-willed emperor. They say Napoleon believed in a star of destiny. He would gaze up at the night sky, pointing to a single bright star, murmuring, "That is my star. As long as it shines, I will win." But his superstition didn't end with bold words. He always carried with him little charms, tiny gris-gris of black silk, hand-sewn and hidden in his uniform. On the nights before great battles, his servants would see him take them out, fingers tracing each thread like a child clutching a talisman against the dark. Even more strangely, Napoleon never publicly admitted to being superstitious. He always acted like he didn't believe in such frivolous things, yet he could never fully let them go. Perhaps that was the contradiction of a man who understood that even the strongest need something invisible to believe in, something to steady their own heart. There's an anecdote. On a night before the Egyptian campaign, Napoleon quietly stepped out of his tent and looked up at the star-filled sky. An aide asked, "Your Majesty, what are you searching for in that endless sky?" Napoleon simply replied, "A reminder that I am not alone." His superstition wasn't just a habit. It was a silent confession that even with an empire at his feet, there were still cold nights, when he didn't know where to place his trust except in some distant glimmer of light. Just like the drops of cologne he dabbed on his wrists, that fragrant armour against fear, those tiny charms were his final mask. And what's even more curious is how he dramatised his own image. Napoleon wasn't just a general, he was a master storyteller. He understood that in the eyes of the crowd, the truth was only worth as much as the belief people placed in it. Napoleon was intensely aware of his image. He didn't wait for others to build his legend, he built it himself, carefully arranging every patch of light and shadow. The painting, Napoleon crossing the Alps, is a perfect example. You've seen it, haven't you? He's astride a white horse, hand raised skyward, snow swirling like a crown. A grand image and a lie. The truth, Napoleon didn't cross the Alps on some noble steed. He rode a tired mule, sturdy, slow, and far from majestic. But he wouldn't allow that image to survive in history. People don't remember the victor. They remember the one who becomes a legend. For Napoleon, every step was a performance. During military reviews, he knew exactly how to walk slowly, head tilted, just so half threat, half invitation. When shaking hands with his generals, he knew precisely when to place a hand on their shoulder, so the sun would catch the crown of sweat as if even exhaustion was part of his glory. He turned himself into a figure of myth, an actor in the grand play whose audience was all of Europe. Some called it false showmanship. But perhaps Napoleon didn't care. He understood one simple truth. When I pass through, the truth will be buried, but the image that will remain. Yet in the end, Napoleon was still a global commander, a man obsessed with time and speed, convinced that glory only belonged to those who never paused. If Josephine was the wound that never closed, if the bottles of perfume he poured over his skin were ways to hide the fear of being forgotten, then the greatest obsession of his life, the one every historian agrees on, was time itself. He didn't just race against his enemies, he raced against every tick of the clock. There were nights when the whole camp slept, but the light in Napoleon's tent still burned. On his table, maps spread out like an open wound, and he, cloaked in black eyes glinting like a blade, meticulously drew up every route, adjusting every tiny mark. He feared the pause. He feared that even a single idle second would reveal him for what he truly was, the child mocked and dismissed in Corsica, the boy who knew that if the lights went out he would be nothing again. Napoleon once said, "Speed is everything. A man who hesitates for even a moment may never rise again." For him, time wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. He moved like a storm while his enemies still hesitated. He had already seized the bridge, crossed the river, choked the enemy's throat with impossible speed. And that madness, that refusal to sleep, to stop, to wait, turned him into the nightmare that Europe could never forget. But few know that in the fever of that speed he was consumed by another obsession detail. They say he didn't just want to know how many cannons he had. He wanted the weight of every cannonball, the number of loaves of bread for each squad, the count of screws in an old musket. Why? Because he believed power didn't rest in grand decisions, it was hidden in every tiny crack. A broken screw could topple an empire. A single false report could shred the image he had built so carefully. For Napoleon, this wasn't just fastidiousness. It was how he silenced the laughter of his childhood, where every mistake was an excuse to call him the peasant boy. Details they were his last shield, the armour of a child raised in doubt and fear. There was once a story told by a soldier during the Italian campaign. He sat there all night adjusting the bread rations as if he wasn't preparing for breakfast but for eternity itself. And that perhaps is the strangest thing about Napoleon, a conqueror who never stopped, yet one who feared his own shadow to death. A man who could raise his hand and command tens of thousands to charge, but who lay awake at night tortured because Josephine hadn't replied to his letter. A man who knew that on the battlefield 1 second too slow meant death, but in his heart he also knew to be slow for a single word of love was a different kind of death, a quieter one. Some might call that a contradiction. But maybe it was exactly this contradiction that made Napoleon a man no one could ever fully grasp. He didn't just live in a world of guns and maps, he lived in a world where every breath was a question. Do I truly exist, or am I only the name that others fear? When he walked the streets of Paris and the crowds shouted "Vive l'Empereur," he knew those cheers would vanish as quickly as cannon smoke. When he conquered Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, he knew those were just rungs on a ladder, not the final destination. And when he lay awake at night, fingers tracing the letters Josephine once sent, he knew he was still just a man begging for a single word of a love, a word no crown could ever buy. In the end, it was that obsession with speed, with detail, with the need to reach for eternity, that made Napoleon both strange and familiar, both human and almost superhuman. Familiar because he loved. He feared, he longed to be seen like all of us. Strange because he took those fears and built them into an empire, into a firestorm, into a legend that made the whole world tremble. And maybe that's why when we speak of Napoleon, we're not just talking about battles. We're talking about an endless hunger, a hunger to be seen, to carve his name into stone, into paper, into the very fear of others. And in that hunger there was something deeply human, but also something almost mythical. So tonight, when we close these old pages of history, remember, Napoleon was not just the Emperor of France. He was the emperor of every restless hunger in love, in victory, and every drop of cologne, every tiny screw of a cannon wheel. And that is the final secret. Napoleon, the immortal emperor, or the child who was never truly loved, the answer only he knows, and only the night knows.